Here's a video for you. Now, it's not one of the videos I was planning to do and have been working on to upload this week, and apologies for the lack of videos since the weekend, but I just haven't had time to sort of sit and focus and get stuff done. But there are a couple on the way this week which I hope you'll enjoy, including this unexpected one. Last night, Tuesday night, I sat at home and I wanted to watch something light. I didn't want to watch anything too heavy. I wanted to watch something a bit nostalgic, something that might possibly be a retro movie review. And I chanced upon a film from 1976 called At the Earth's Core. And guess where we're going today? My name is Paul Mount, but you're very welcome, more than welcome in fact, to call me that bloke on YouTube. If you're new here, and you may well be, don't forget, please like and subscribe. It's lovely to get more subscribers. We've had several dozen over the last week or so, which is fantastic, and I hope you all stick around, and I hope you're all looking back at the old videos. There are hundreds of them back there, talking about films and DVDs and movies and all sorts of stuff. So hope you're having a good old time trawling back through the back catalogue. Subscribers as well, please do come back and view the videos, because my analytics tell me that nearly 70% of my views are from people who aren't subscribed to the channel, which does my head in, frankly. So like and subscribe to the channel. It's just a nice thing to do, and it just helps the channel bubble over quite nicely. So it would be nice to have you stick around, and of course it's always nice to have those comments. Some great comments coming in all my videos now, and I do appreciate them all, and I do try to reply to them all if I can. One or two might slip through the net, so apologies if you've left me a message and I've been so rude and not to reply. Unintentional, of course. Right, today's video then takes us back to 1976 and a film called At the Earth's Core. A little bit of background to the company that made certainly the first three of these films. Amicus Productions were a sort of lower rent version of Hammer, a rival to Hammer in the 60s and 70s. They made lots of horror anthology films with lower budgets, but often with good star casts. Peter Cushing would often turn up in their films, and they were also responsible in the mid-60s for the two Doctor Who films starring Peter Cushing, but they created a new production company called RU Productions, because already at that time Amicus were associated with horror, and I think as effectively children's films. It wasn't felt appropriate for Amicus to be producing Doctor Who films, so RU was created as an alternative name. In the 1970s, Amicus branched out a little bit, and they started making family children's adventure films, initially based on the works of Edgar Rice Burroughs, who of course created Tarzan, many other high-powered, adrenalized adventure stories for kids back in the early 20th century. The films were put together by a producer called John Dark, who worked alongside Milton Subotsky and Max J. Rosenberg, names that all Doctor Who fans will know from those two Doctor Who films, to create a series of adventure films which were skewed towards children but had family appeal as well. They brought on board a director called Kevin Connor, and across a period of about 6 years they made 5 of these very low budget, fairly low brow adventure films, that the first 2 or 3 at least of which did particularly well at the box office. Amicus unfortunately disappeared in 1976, 77. They were wound up, so the last 2 films in this chain of 5 films were produced under Thorn EMI, who took over. The first film was called The Land That Time Forgot, came out in 1974. This was a rousing boys' own adventure film set in World War I about a German U-boat that finds itself in a strange kingdom full of creatures and monsters and volcanoes and all sorts of peril. It was a decent-sized hit, and a follow-up film, not a sequel, was commissioned called At the Earth's Core, and that's the one I spent 90 minutes of my time with last night, and I had a really good time with it. I saw this film when it came out. I would have seen this back in the 70s, and I sort of have vague memories of going to see it at a long-gone cinema in the centre of Cardiff. And I think that as a fan of films by Ray Harryhausen and some of the George Powell films, although at the time I wouldn't necessarily have known those names, I was aware of the difference between their films and this film, which looks distinctly shonky and looks like what it is, a low-budget British genre film. That doesn't mean to say you can't have fun with it. The story basically concerns Dr. Abner Perry, played by Peter Cushing. He is playing his version of Doctor Who again. It's as simple as that. The way he speaks, his mannerisms, the way he's dressed, everything about this performance harkens back to his Doctor Who performance in the 1960s. I suppose you could, in a way, regard this as a third Doctor Who film. because the story, in fact, as we'll discover, is actually quite similar to that first Doctor Who film from '65. But here he plays Dr. Abner Perry, and with his colleague David Innes, played by the reliable hunky American actor Doug McClure, who had been appearing in cowboy series in American television and came over to the UK to make The Land That Time Forgot and stuck around to make a few more of these sorts of films. He plays David Innes, he's Abner's assistant, and they're in the Welsh Valleys apparently, more on that in a moment, and they're being watched by a rather small crowd of extras as their drilling machine, which is a huge mechanical mole device, not dissimilar to the mole from the Thunderbirds TV series, drills its way into the mountainside and penetrates deep into the Earth's crust. It sort of goes out of control and eventually pitches up in a strange prehistoric landscape, which is somewhere between the core of the Earth and the surface of the Earth. Abner and David leave their craft, and there is quite an amusing sequence where they're wandering around all this weird vegetation and purple trees and great hanging branches, and Peter Cushing's character looks around and goes, "I don't think we're in the Rhondda Valley anymore." Well, I live in the Rhondda Valley these days, and yes, there are some strange creatures walking the streets, but nothing quite like the creature that lumbers out of the forest towards them a few moments later on. It's a giant thing. It's a sort of strange chicken-beaked creature, which is sort of 2 or 3 times the size of a man, with wings and arms, and it sort of crashes its way through the jungle, following Abner and David. And the thing looks ridiculous because it is a costume. It's a man in a costume. Now, they didn't have a budget for stop motion animation, so all the creatures in this film are costumed creatures, people in costumes, and how successful they are depends on how good the costumes are and how good you are at suspending your imagination, because this thing looks ridiculous. It's a giant man-sized thing with a chicken's head. It's shrieking and clucking and chasing them through the forest. I think there's some quite well done sort of, not exactly green screen scenes, but back projection scenes where this thing, you see the size of this thing, you see these two trying to escape from it. Some not quite so good scenes when Peter Cushing is in a tree and the tree is sort of being swayed back and forth in front of a back projection. The effects are dodgy. I mean, the effects are dodgy throughout the film by modern standards because there's no CGI, none of that technology is available. They didn't have the budget for stop motion, so the monsters had to be created out of costumes, which in a way is a feat of imagination in itself because people had to design these things and build them and operate them. And by those standards, they're sort of impressive. Our 2 heroes now are wandering through the forest and suddenly they're captured by a bunch of ape-like creatures called Sagoths or Sagoths. There are lots of them and they get dragged in with this crowd of natives who are being held captive. The Sagoths are an odd bunch because they've got these sort of primate-type heads, like half masks, but they've got humanoid sort of chins and features underneath. And they make very strange noises. They speak in a very strange way. The only way that I can really describe it, and this won't make much sense if you've never seen it, there is a classic Rowan Atkinson sketch, and I was trying to think what it was last night, when he speaks in this sort of garbled, gibberish voice. And I was really trying to work out and remember. It was a sketch from Not the 9 O'Clock News or some show that Rowan Atkinson did back in the 70s and 80s, where he speaks in this very garbly sort of voice. It's very odd. That's how the Sagoths sound anyway. The Sagoths capture them all and they're all taken into this huge chamber. Production design is quite decent. It's all mostly set underground in these caves and volcanic tunnels, and that all looks really good. It's a very colourful film. The sets are great. There's this massive cave with lava flooding around it and the lava bridge. And they're taken into the cave where these 5 creatures are watching from up above. They're called the Mayhars. And they are sort of reptile, pterodactyl type creatures, which look quite imposing and quite creepy when they're standing up on the rocks, looking down at the Sagoths and their terrified prisoners, who include Princess Dia, played by Carolyn Munro, who was one of the leading fantasy females of the era. She appeared in lots of Hammer films and lots of these sort of films as this scantily clad woman in distress, which many people would frown at today, I'm sure. But these things are gazing down at them, and they are quite eerie, standing there, sort of swaying gently. And they communicate telepathically with the Sagoths, and that's quite well done because there's a shot of a Sagoth looking in a trance and a close-up of the beaked face of this creature, and suddenly its eye sort of blinks, and there's a sound that denotes this sort of telepathic communication between them, and the Mayars communicate with the Sagoths via this telepathic link. And this is all, quite entertaining. I think where the film falls down really is when you get these creatures moving about. It's quite a nasty idea. There's nothing nasty about the way it's done. They sort of capture people and presumably take them up to devour them. You don't see any of that. The creatures swoop down, but they're sort of obviously on Kirby wires, and they're sort of swinging around out of control. And to be fair, the director has made an effort to make it look weird by not sort of focusing directly on them flying about, but the camera, the different angles, and they're shown in different aspects, so you don't necessarily see too much of the rather obvious men in costumes on wires being spun around, but it is a bit obvious that that's how it's done. And because the creatures themselves look a bit silly, I think across the film, I think perhaps it would have worked a bit better if we hadn't seen them in so much close-up, if we'd seen them in shadows, just the movement of an arm or a wing or something, an eye. That is much more disturbing than what we actually see, because what we actually see when we do see them are these very silly looking bird costumes, very obviously with actors in them, flapping about, swinging around on wires, and being not really very mobile. And I think sometimes it's often said that the best horrors are the ones you don't really see, the things hiding in the shadows, the things lurking in the half-light. And I think that these things would have benefited by being filmed that way, rather than such extreme close-up as they often are, which takes any sense of fear away. And certainly I remember seeing this film in the 70s and not being convinced by these creatures, but enjoying the story. And that's what this is about. And I think with a film like this, if you watch it now, if you've never seen it before, you will need to sort of reset your brain, recalibrate it a bit, not expect all the glossy, slightly soulless stuff we get today, and appreciate the artistry of what went into this film. These practical sets, there's no volume here, there's no massive CGI fests at the end. This is all done very practically. The story itself then is very simplistic, very straightforward. Abner and David, of course, falls in love with Princess Deer, because you would, wouldn't you? She's not your woman. I think feminists will tear their hair out at this, because there's all this stuff about her being the belonging to David. It is just completely flies in the face of everything that films do today. But that is part of its charm as well. It's sort of naive in that respect. But he falls in love with her. She apparently falls in love with him. He witnesses an atrocity, which we don't see. Obviously, the creatures swoop down and grab up their sacrifices, 3 or 4 people, and, as I say, presumably take them away to devour them. David is so appalled by this, he decides that these creatures have to be destroyed. He teams up with one of the natives called Ra, who's played by Cy Grant, a black actor. If you have time, go and look at Cy Grant's Wikipedia entry, because his life is extraordinary. His experiences and the things he did through his career, not just as an actor, as a musician, a poet, a lawyer, an incredible breadth of experience. He was one of the first black faces seen regularly on TV in the 1950s and into the 1960s. And you'll find out more of that if you spend a few minutes looking at his Wikipedia page, assuming it's all accurate, of course, because Wikipedia isn't always completely accurate. Of course, fantasy fans will know him, I suppose, particularly playing the voice of Lieutenant Green in Captain Scarlet and the Mist Swans in 1968. And that series was quite ahead of its time, really, because you had this character, Lieutenant Green, aboard the Spectrum Skybase. You had a black character, and this is something which didn't happen much at that time. So the story just follows the course that you might expect. David and Abner G up the natives into launching an attack on the city of the Mayars. The Mayars are destroyed, there's big explosions, bang, volcanoes, fighting. It's all quite well staged, the action scenes are quite well done, there's a few punch-ups here and there. It's competently done. I think what lets it down is it is a simplistic story. I think, as I mentioned, as I hinted at earlier, I think the story really is the story of Doctor Who and the Daleks in the way. Strangers from another world arrive at a strange new land where a race is being oppressed by a more powerful race, and the 2 lead characters, the newbies, have to work together with the oppressed to overthrow the oppressors. It's basically Doctor Who and the Daleks, but with the Mayars instead of the Daleks. It's an entertaining film, but I think if you watch it, as I said, if you watched it at the time, it will be a period piece that will bring back great memories for you. As I said, when I saw it in the 70s, I know that I was conscious of the fact that the monsters were a bit tacky and it was all a bit underpowered. But I think a lot of people will have watched it and been completely taken in by it. And I enjoyed it. I always enjoy this sort of stuff. But I think it's a really interesting curio from the 70s. These are films which have been largely forgotten. I wouldn't say they've been wiped out of British cinematic history, but they're not celebrated particularly. There were 5 of these films. As I said, this was followed up by The People That Time Forgot in 1977, which was in fact a sequel to The Land That Time Forgot, went back to the same location and brought back Doug McClure's character. After that, Amicus went into liquidation. They closed down. The following 2 films were made, but with John Dark still producing. Milton Subotsky and Max J. Rosenberg were no longer on the scene. Kevin Connor was still directing. And there were 2 films, 1978's Warlords of Atlantis and in 1979 Arabian Adventure. These were of interest because they were written by Brian Hales, a writer who Doctor Who fans will know. He created the Ice Warriors, the iconic Ice Warriors for Doctor Who, and of course the Celestial Toymaker, who still has a residence in Doctor Who today. And in fact, Brian Hales passed away in 1979. He just delivered a script for another film in this run, which would have featured ghost pirates, apparently. I think the issues with these films that the first couple were quite successful and then they started becoming less successful. So it's interesting that there were plans for a 6th film. But I think these 5 films together are really interesting block of films that arrived at a time when cinema was suddenly becoming blockbuster conscious. You had Jaws, which rewrote the rules for box office in 1975. The year after this came out, Star Wars came along and that changed cinema forever. This might well have been the film that he did before he moved on to Star Wars. So it's interesting that this body of little British, charmingly naive adventure films appeared at this time when box office expectations were changing and bigger films were being made as technology was improving and cinema was telling bigger stories. These films sort of sit almost as a bridge between the naivety of 60s and early 70s, the more sophisticated films that were to come afterwards. They are really nice little films. If you sit and watch them in the right frame of mind, I think you'll just enjoy them for what they are. They're completely unpretentious. They're completely unsubtle. There's no subtext to them. They're just monsters and good guys fighting. And that's basically what you get. And sometimes there's nothing wrong with that. At the Earth's Core. Now, where you can find this if you want to watch it now, I'm not entirely sure. It's on DVD. I'm sure you can pick it up on DVD. I don't think it's on any of the streaming services, but it's well worth trying to track down if you can for a piece of nostalgia if you saw the films at the time. And it is quite likely that you have forgotten all about these films because, as I said, they were made and they went away and nobody's really talked about them much since then. Nobody's celebrated them for what they did, which was to make unassuming, cheap, exciting films for kids in the mid-70s. So if you could track these films down, I don't think I've seen Warlords of Atlantis or Arabian Adventure, but I've certainly seen the first 3. And I think that they're good fun, but if you're new to them, just watch them for what they are, not what they're not. Right, thank you for watching this video. Hope you've enjoyed it. It's an unexpected little trip back in time that I wasn't expecting to do this week. But if you've enjoyed the video, why not like and subscribe to the channel? Leave a comment down below. I'd be interested to hear from people who remember At the Earth's Core and its ilk, what your memories of them are. And if you're interested in tracking them down if you've never seen them, that might be fun for you too. So yes, like, subscribe, leave a comment down below if you are interested. You're probably admiring this t-shirt, aren't you? Keep taking the stuff t-shirt. Still available. I'll leave a link down below in the description so you too can look like this. Thank you for watching. I'll see you soon. Until I do, keep taking the stuff.